All right, I'd like to thank introduce our next speaker. Elise Hopman will be telling us a little bit about producing during language learning affects comprehension.
Okay. So let's think about how speaking and listening during second language learning, is that better? So let's think about how speaking and listening during early second language learning would affect later language comprehension. Imagine a production-focused second language learning curriculum in which students are asked to speak in the new language immediately, not just trying to repeat one or two words, but instead being asked to produce whole grammatical sentences within the first hour. Such an intense production-focused experience would of course improve production ability. However, we hypothesize that this focused production experience would also improve comprehension performance when compared to a more comprehension-focused curriculum. So more specifically, we're suggesting that production might be a stronger learning experience than comprehension, and that this learning might transfer from production to comprehension. So let's consider the first claim here. We think that language production might be a stronger learning experience than language comprehension. Why would we predict this? There's some evidence from the memory literature that's suggestive that producing might be a stronger learning experience than comprehending. When you speak, it requires more attention than when you listen. And this increased attention might improve learning. You also hear yourself talk, and this adds listening experience. This is known as the production effect. When learning lists of words, you remember words that you spoke out loud better than words that you only heard. Finally, production involves recalling words from memory, whereas in comprehension, you only have to recognize what is said. This is known as the testing effect. It has been shown when learning new words that recall practice leads to better learning than recognition practice. However, these memory results are all at the single word level. And while this is relevant, language processing goes beyond the single word level because language involves dependencies between words. So here we want to investigate the role of production in sentence level learning. Okay, so let's think about what happens during language production. When we're speaking, we're mapping from a message to an utterance. And there's serial order planning involved in language production, ordering the components of the to be produced utterance and binding them in working memory during planning and production. This binding may strengthen the learning of dependencies among items. So production processes could yield improved grammatical learning beyond any boost to learning of individual words. Of course, it's a question whether or not this learning would transfer to comprehension. The other way around, any learning that happens during comprehension does immediately benefit later comprehension performance. However, rather than thinking of comprehension as involving all of these same detailed representations, comprehenders may also settle for a good enough interpretation without a detailed analysis of all the syntactic dependencies, especially early on in second language learning. So production practice may be a stronger learning experience than comprehension practice for later comprehension skills. So in order to test the hypothesis that producing improves later comprehension, especially of grammatical dependencies, we designed an artificial language learning experiment. People learn languages in either a comprehension condition or a production learning condition. And after training, we tested participants' comprehension performance with a focus on learning of grammatical dependencies. And as explained, we predict that production participants will outperform comprehension participants. While production and comprehension are inherently different, we carefully designed our training tasks to balance some of those differences between our learning conditions. And I'll tell you how we set up that training. We want people in both conditions to have a learning experience that's as similar as possible. So both groups get passive and active learning experience. All participants start to learn new words in a passive exposure task, where they see a picture and hear a word, and this is exactly the same in both conditions. For people in the comprehension condition, the active learning task is to make a match-mismatch judgment. So they see a picture and they hear a phrase, and then they have to indicate whether they think the phrase matches or mismatches the picture. And on half of the trials they see, it mismatches in one or more of the words. After this, they get feedback in the form of the correct word. Producers, on the other hand, get a speaking task, where they're asked to name the picture. And they too get feedback in the form of the correct word once they're done talking. The first part of these active tasks is different. But it's important to note that they're controlled to balance two of the earlier mentioned differences from the memory literature between production and comprehension that we're not interested in testing here. To control for attention, both producers and comprehenders have an active task where they need to engage with the materials and do something. We also control for listening experience. So production participants hear themselves say something which may or may not be correct, but comprehension participants also hear something which may or may not be correct. So we teach people the language by iterating through these passive and active tasks with equal amount of each type of trials in both conditions, gradually building up from single words to full sentences. So let's look at what a full sentence in our language looks like.
Zevok, magok, chag, at, zevok, homon.
Okay, so this is the sentence that you just heard as it refers to the animation you just saw. And real participants never saw the language written out, they only ever heard it. And the pseudo-English translation would be something like, the yellow monster with spots moves at the planet with the river. This language has 18 words in total, and this is a pretty long sentence. So it might seem like a hard language for people to learn. But from piloting, we know that people can learn this full language within an hour. There's a lot of dependencies in this language. Number agreement, gender agreement, and both adjacent and non-adjacent dependencies. The data I'm going to show you today is averaged over all of those dependencies, since none of that interacted with learning condition. So to illustrate the stimuli, I'll just use number agreement as my example throughout. Notice that there's 4 words in this sentence that take on the same suffix. And this is what that same sentence would have been if it were about 2 monsters. Okay, so let's walk through the experiment. We trained 60 comprehension participants and 62 production participants. And the first test we did after training was a screening test to see if participants had learned the individual words. And based on piloting, we set the threshold to be 80% correct. And most participants in both groups passed that threshold with no difference between groups. So the results I'll talk about today will only take these 104 participants into account. So then we had both some first choice and some error monitoring measures, both of which were comprehension tests. In the first choice comprehension measure, we had a vocabulary and phrases test, as well as a suffix understanding test. And since we're especially interested in learning grammatical dependencies, I'll use this as an example item to explain the measure. So in the suffix understanding test, people hear a fragment and have to choose which of 2 pictures it matches.
Famoko, wimoko, chag, at.
So if you know what the suffixes mean, you should be faster and more accurate to pick out the correct picture. In this case, the suffix oko is plural, so the correct answer is the 2 monsters on the right. So our dependent variables here are accuracy and reaction time. And then in our error monitoring during comprehension measure, we had word order errors as well as suffix agreement errors, which I'll use as my example. And it's important to note that this measure also included correct sentences. So we want to see if people are aware that all 4 suffixes in the sentence have to agree. So we test that by having people listen to sentences and have them judge whether the sentence is grammatical or not, without seeing a picture on the screen that the sentence refers to.
Vok, famok, zautoko, stam, at, havok, creole.
So in this example, the suffix on the 3rd word does not agree with the other words. And again, our dependent variables here are accuracy and reaction time. So to summarize, for each of these comprehension tests, we got measures of accuracy and reaction time. And all of those results are printed in the abstract, but in the interest of time, I'll mainly focus on the results from the suffix tests here, but I'll start with the vocabulary and phrases test accuracy scores because we use those as a covariate. For the covariate, we tested understanding of words when you hear them in a sentence. Because if you're hearing a sentence and you're struggling to understand the words in there, that might affect your ability to comprehend the grammatical dependencies between the words. I'm plotting here the accuracy score for the vocabulary and phrases test. Y-axis is proportion correct, and on the x-axis I have both learning conditions. And remember that we trained people to ceiling on single word understanding in the screening test. So we're hoping that they're equal on this more difficult test stepping into vocabulary as well. And we do find that people in both learning conditions do equally well. There's no significant differences here. We do, however, have a range of individual differences with considerable variation, and we use a participant's individual score here as a covariate to regress out a measure of vocabulary. This way, any differences between groups in knowledge of suffixes are true over and above potential differences in word understanding. So let's go to the results of the dependency tests now. We'll start by looking at the suffix comprehension test. Remember, that's the one where participants have to choose between two pictures. We'll look at accuracy first. So I'm plotting proportion correct on the y-axis, and the x-axis will have the comprehension and the production learning condition. We predict that production experience will help you understand the suffixes better, so higher accuracy here for the production learning condition, which is indeed what we find. Producers are significantly more accurate over and above that vocabulary covariate. We also looked at speed. I'm plotting reaction time on the y-axis here and both learning conditions on the x-axis. We predict that production experience will help you be faster at understanding what the suffixes mean, so lower reaction time here for the production learning condition, which is again what we find. Participants in the production learning condition are significantly faster. Then let's look at the results of the agreement error test. We'll start by looking at accuracy again, with proportion correct on the y-axis and both learning conditions on the x-axis. We predict that producing during learning will give participants an advantage in catching these agreement errors, which is indeed what we find. The production learning condition is significantly more accurate here. Then we also look at speed. So I'm plotting reaction time on the y-axis and learning condition on the x-axis, and we predict that producing the language during learning will also make you faster at catching agreement errors, which is what we find. Production participants are significantly faster. So to summarize, in 2 tests of agreement, we found that the production group was faster and more accurate than the comprehension group, over and above any differences in vocabulary understanding, and while reducing for the effects of attention and listening experience, showing that, as we hypothesized, production experience during learning improves comprehension performance of the grammatical regularities we're interested in. So, production is a stronger learning experience than comprehension, and this learning during production does transfer to comprehension. This result has several theoretical implications. It extends the memory results I discussed beyond the single word level. And as for the debate about overlapping representations in comprehension and production, these results are consistent with there being overlap between production and comprehension, at least at the grammatical level, as evidenced by the transfer of learning that we see here. So I'd like to thank everyone who was involved in this research, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts and happy to take any questions.
I'm Jerry Altman. I hope I'm still at UConn. So I just wanted to ask a question about the training that I may have missed and the difference between the comprehension and production groups. So the comprehension people had a fourth choice where they would click yes or no in a match-mismatch test. And I wondered if you had yoked the production people so that they would utter a word, and on occasion they would utter the wrong word and they'd say, no, that is the wrong word. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think it's relevant to, I do think it might matter whether the input that you hear during training, whether it's from yourself or from the experiment, how often that's wrong or not. Yeah. Honestly, this was just a start. So we started with 50% correct in the comprehension condition. And we have thought about in future maybe replications of this to yoke it.
So one thing you could possibly do, I don't know if you can pull it out statistically, but you've presumably got information from the comprehenders, how many times they heard a mismatching pair, and look to see if that predicts their performance in any way. If it did, then you'd know that would be something you'd have to control for if you want to actually match your two groups.
Yeah, we're actually in the process of analyzing how, because the analyses and the data that I showed you today were all about the comprehension performance afterwards, but we're in the process of analyzing what people actually did during training and how that affected their performance at test. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, it was a great talk, by the way. I really enjoyed it, and I have actually learnt the OCO affix.
Yes. Hi, my name's Laura Moret. I'm at Yale currently, and I'm moving to the University of Alabama. I had a related question in a way. I was wondering, so is it the case, if I'm not mistaken, it's the case that in the production learning condition, they are not given feedback, right?
So actually, in both conditions, you do get feedback. You don't get explicit feedback, but after you try and other the word, so maybe that might be magoko or something, or magok because it's singular, you do then, after you're done talking, you hear what the correct utterance would have been. So that's not explicit feedback saying, hey, what you did was wrong or right, but it is feedback in the sense that if you compare the two.
Yeah, the reason I asked was because I don't know how familiar you are with like the methods of second language teaching, but it reminds me very much of a method called audiolingualism that was kind of in favor back in the 50s, in which basically the way it worked was the teacher would say something and the student would either repeat it or they would have to do something, like they might have to inflect the verb or something of that nature, but it was very rote, it was like very drill-like, and it fell very much out of favor after that. In like the 70s and 80s in favor of more comprehension based, where it was thought that like second language learners shouldn't produce, they should act like babies who can't speak and that sort of thing. So anyway, so I mean, that's just kind of, you know, another direction, but I was just, you know, I just wanted to bring that up because I thought it was relevant.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. I had never heard of that account. What I will say, though, is that the way we think about this is, because we never explicitly teach any of these participants anything about the grammar. And in that sense, they're asked to generate, just generate the word for the picture before they get the feedback. So they're not really like repeating in that sense. So I do think of this as more like implicit, like.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why I asked about feedback, was because, I mean, that's a key part of the method.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, but thanks. I will look that research up. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.